redesigning every
Hello and welcome. I'm Maria Ressa. I'm here in Manila about to speak with Parag Khanna. He is a global perspective of democracies around the world. His latest book, Technocracy in America, The Rise of the Info State, is out. You've got to look at it. One of the most thoughtful leaders out right now, thought leaders here. Parag, thanks for coming and joining us.
Thanks, Maria. Always great to talk to you.
So I want to find out what you thought of President Obama's speech this morning. Anything new? What surprised you? How do we wrap up the Obama years?
This has been building for a long time. Obviously, everyone's been anticipating this speech because so much of the last couple of months has been about this realization that Trump was already acting like he's president. And so the question was, how could Obama defend his legacy in a context where Trump is already seeking to dismantle it every single day? Obviously, as we've come to expect from Obama, he was very eloquent, he was soaring. He did look back, obviously, at the sweep of 8 years, and there's no doubt that unemployment is certainly lower than one would expect it to have been when he inherited the financial crisis. Of course, presidents always take credit for the positive economic things that happen under their watch. But he talked about foreign relations, obviously opening up ties to Cuba, to Iran, and so forth. Let's face it, at the end of the day, we don't really remember the specific speech. We remember what lasted and what didn't last. And now, for better or worse, no matter how we feel, how much we love Obama as a man, a lot of the signature issues are really going to be in doubt, whether it's financial regulation or Obamacare or the diplomatic initiatives, you name it. So, it's unfortunate, but that's the way democracy is. And of course, things can swing very wildly.
Again, many Americans, both the experts in particular, but Americans were surprised by the win of Trump. What does that show about the state of American democracy?
Well, it shows that it's a very divided society. And when you have a system where whether it's, direct vote for president, in which case obviously Hillary Clinton would have won, but the fact is that, even though she won the popular vote, she didn't win it by 10 million or 20 million or 30 million, which many obviously feel she should have. She won it by a mere, 2.5 or 3 million. So the fact is you have a very divided society no matter which way the election tilted, right? So that's something that's going to be with us no matter what. And of course, the way in which Trump won just shows that there are these antiquated institutions that obviously need to be modified and reformed. And of course, probably won't be because they served Trump to win, and he wouldn't win without the Electoral College and so forth. So we remain a very divided society. There's going to be, this sense of aggressiveness on the part of Republicans to, sort of push their agenda through. But there's still a sizable Democrat presence, obviously, in the House and the Senate, and so on. So, it's going to be a lot of what we've quite frankly, come to expect, gridlock. And by the way, where you don't have gridlock, you just have this back and forth. Just because something has been done decisively, let's say like rolling back Obamacare, has it been replaced with something smart? The question is not, who's got the upper hand? The question is, do Americans have health care? Yeah. Right? The question is not, do we have lots of financial regulation, or do we have no financial regulation? The question is the economy functioning well to the benefit of the citizens? And if we ask those two questions, in addition to 10 more questions where we look at outcomes and outputs, not just inputs, we unfortunately will have to come away believing, without any doubt that the next 4 years or longer is really going to be a lot of muddling through.
You wrote a whole book about where you think American democracy should go, and there's actually lots of examples you give about different types of democracy. So let's take America apart first. Essentially, you're telling us the future of democracy, right? So let's take America. What should it do if you could do it? What needs to be done to redesign American democracy?
It's a great question. That's why I devoted this whole book, Technocracy in America, to looking at how to modernize the design of the entire federal government. You know, I've got org charts and everything that kind of show you what should the government look like if it wants to actually be effective. And number one, you have what I call a collective presidency. You have not just one man in the Oval Office, but you have 7 or 8 people, a committee, a management committee for the country. And those aren't all they can all be elected officials. He can draw on people from Congress. He can draw on technocrats and civil servants to create this sort of executive committee. So that's step one. Another thing, as I argue, and this has been obviously taken as a very radical idea in the U.S., and it's to abolish the Senate entirely and to replace it with an assembly of governors. Now, you know, Maria, there's this whole movement towards states and cities are the real locus of action.
Yes.
That's where change happens. Well, in America, states and governors and mayors are competent leaders. They're people who know how to run, how to administer, how to do budgets and bureaucracies.
Yep.
They should be setting policy in Washington. And then I say that the members of the Supreme Court should be selected on the basis of their willingness to engage in a progressive evolution and modification of the Constitution, which hasn't been modified in decades, whereas other progressive democracies do update their constitutions. And just one more thing, very importantly, I argue for a strong civil service. The kind that what Singapore has, what China has, what America used to have,
yeah.
what Britain used to have. But these civil service entities, these professional, competent, technocratic individuals who are apolitical, nonpartisan, who know how to run agencies and how to deliver benefits to the people, that institution has atrophied in America, and that's also too bad. So I've got 4 or 5 major recommendations.
At the core of a lot of the things that you've put, aside from the experience and the actual experience of governance at the local level, so building this stuff up, is technology and information. But you could also argue that technology and information now, technology has empowered people who were once marginalized, and that's actually led to the rise of populist leaders like Mr. Trump and Mr. Duterte here in the Philippines. How do you winning in a democracy, in a presidential democracy like the United States and the Philippines, doesn't guarantee that you know how to govern necessarily.
Right.
How do you look at these populist movements, and where do you see it going now?
Let's separate a couple of things. You know, again, in my view, in a technocratic system, you have a meritocratic selection of your leaders, right? But in a democratic system, especially one in which the populace or members of society or business are empowered with social media, they can create a movement and get themselves elected, as Trump has just done. But let's not blame technology for that. Let's remember that the people, the everyday citizens, the hundreds of millions of people have legitimate opinions and grievances, right? This is about them. And if they sympathize with a populist perspective, then they have a right to vote for that perspective. You don't blame Facebook and so forth for that. What bothers me so much is that the conversation is so incredibly unsophisticated. You blame social media just because some people manipulate and send out fake news, and people aren't willing to see whether or not that same ridiculous tabloid story has been published multiple times in multiple places and realize that it is sort of fraudulent. I think that's embarrassing. Technology and social media and information about what people feel is an enormous resource. We shouldn't be wanting to pack it back into the bottle, put the genie back in the bottle. We should be harnessing it, analyzing it. Smart governments say all of this data is telling us that people in this district or this geography are very upset about the lack of good infrastructure, the lack of jobs, the lack of education. Why aren't we using that? And so I'm very disappointed with the state of the discussion on technology and social media. And of course, I appreciate that it can strengthen the hand of populists. But guess what? The populism, not all populism is bad. We have to remember that this is reflecting legitimate opinions of people.
Absolutely. In this transition, so what we've seen both in the United States and the Philippines is democracy. The old power structures turned upside down. And you could argue that it's about time that that's happened, right? And that technology's empowered that. But while we're headed to that long future, the medium-term future, how do you see it? How do you see it being handled now? What is the best way? And I ask in particular because the Philippines is 6 months ahead of the United States, and we're struggling through this. What are your perspectives on the best way moving forward?
Specifically on the technology and social media angle, right? Yeah, and I think actually there are many countries that are ahead of the U.S. on this, quite frankly, in the experience. Places that are, again, even more saturated with that online conversation where people feel even more vested in the political outcomes. Remember, America has a very low voter turnout.
Yes.
Right, it's among the lowest in in democratic societies. So there are other places where this is a much more lively 24/7 kind of conversation. So we shouldn't be looking to America to learn about how this is going to play out. America is just the latest victim, if you will, of these dynamics. But again, as I said before, the real question in terms of how do you govern a society well is how do you harness this data, how do you harness this information, how do you pinpoint problems and empower solutions through this technology. And there's, again, in the US, there's local efforts that are doing really well. In the state of California, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in Austin, Texas, we see how social media and sort of civic engagement through technology is actually helping solve local problems. And that's what's fueling the devolutionary movement, where Californians are talking about the Calexit, right? The California Brexit. They're saying, hey, you know what? We know how to use referenda, and the referenda and the initiatives in California that make it a bit like Switzerland are going online.
Yes.
So the way, and in Singapore you can do online petitioning now. This is the way to use that technology to, and in Switzerland, of course, as well. And in Estonia, they've got universal digital voting on your phone. Right. So we should be looking all over the world at innovative societies for how they use these technologies to advance genuine democracy.
But let's talk about the danger of some of it, which is, again, fake news is one of those, right? When you're not sure whether the information you have is actually, when you can't even agree on what the facts are. How do you see that being handled? How should citizens and governments deal with this?
Would it be so hard for an independent agency, either within the government or a nonprofit entity, to be doing fact-checking, to be providing information the way other governments do? I don't think it would be that difficult, right? It's just that we tend to look at this as some free-for-all, where all players are equal, and those who have the most sort of viral or trashy or whatever kind of news are going to win, but that's not necessarily true. Again, you can't expect, we're not babies. And I think part of the problem is that in the sort of generic conversation that people have around this, it's treated like everyone is just a docile, uninformed baby. Well, if that is who you are in your society, is you get the government you deserve, right? At some level, there has to be an agency of the citizen, of the consumer of information, who says, you know what, I am going to check out what the independent, media watchdogs saying about what's true and what's not true, and then I'll make my judgment. And if citizens literally can't do that much, I can't help you.
Interesting. So again, what's interesting to me is that you're actually, a meritocracy demands a certain level of sophistication. It demands people who will not go with their cognitive bias, but people in general will go with their cognitive bias. The election, you could argue that if you were making rational choices, that it should have been Hillary Clinton. I mean, does this clash with your vision of a technocratic, of a meritocracy?
It's a great question, but let's be clear. In this book, I barely ever talk about the names Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. I am not interested in individuals or personalities. I'm interested in systems that are as close to foolproof as you can get, with emphasis on fool. And so the real point here is that no matter who's president, how should the system operate to achieve good policies? And that's where the technocratic balance of the democracy comes in. I construct this system called a direct technocracy. Direct democracy like Switzerland, technocracy like Singapore. Now, even if everyone wants to only drink sugary drinks, right? The technocracy says, wait a minute, that's going to create all of these healthcare costs and problems, so we're going to have to figure out a way to impose a tax and make people more responsible, and so on and so on, right? Same thing goes maybe for political outcomes, right? The people may want to elect a certain leader or to implement a certain policy, but that's going to have costs that we can no longer manage. And so the meritocratically selected, Plato would have called them the guardians, technocratic governance system looks at the data around what people want. It looks at what the opinions and sentiments are of people who aren't even voting based on their behavior. It looks at the expert analysis, and it juggles and balances these things into a decision. And if the people don't like that decision, they can still, in a way, vote it out or throw it out, right? But they have to take it into account. And I believe that is the way a proper technocratic system, a democratic technocratic system, would still be in balance.
What are your best examples of functioning democracies in the world right now? I mean, what would be a role model?
Well, what I try and do in this book is to construct a model, right? And I find best practices everywhere. I see the activism of the Swiss populace as being very, very inspiring in the way in which they use initiatives and referenda to dictate to the government. But remember, they're very educated people. They have town halls every 2 weeks, and they're a small society. But again, we should think about the world not in terms of Switzerland is small and America is big, but how can California and Texas and Illinois and New York be more like Switzerland? That makes much more sense. Then I look at the civil service of Singapore, of China, of Germany. I look at the federal court, the Supreme Court of Germany, and the way in which it's reforming and modifying the constitution. I look at the parliamentary, multi-party parliamentary systems in Western Europe, because you have rather than a two-party oligarchy like what America is, where yes, they oppose each other, but they also have a common interest in staying in power and preventing any other party from coming in. I believe if you have 3 or more parties, then there is much more of a demand that they place on each other and that the people place on them to actually govern effectively. Otherwise, they will get thrown out. Right? So a multi-party parliamentary system is a superior system for a legislature. So there isn't one country, right, that's got all of the answers. But every country, and here's the real lesson, Maria, because I know you believe this as someone who spends a lot of time traveling and observing other countries. Every country should study every other country, right? Not just one or the other.
Again, when you mention a multi-party parliamentary system, I've seen systems like that also have gone tremendously wrong. Indonesia under Suharto was a multi-party parliament. Well, not so. 3 parties at that point, 3 main parties. Let me bring you to the Philippines. You've been watching. You're in Singapore. What do you make of Philippine democracy today?
Well, obviously you have your own constitutional debate going on right now about what the sort of division of power, separation of powers within the government. This does happen a lot in emerging markets in a situation where you have a very strong leader who's come in with a sense of a mandate who wants to sort of push certain things through. Again, not all multi-party parliamentary or not all systems with multi-party parliamentary structures are necessarily better. It depends on how much power that parliament has. It can have 50 parties, but if it doesn't have any power, it doesn't make a lot of difference, right? So you have to obviously have, balance the mandate that the executive branch thinks it has with the sort of will of the people as is embodied through these parliamentary sort of processes as well. And I know that that's what you're navigating right now. I tend to take these things, issue by issue. I say, look, you have to the executive branch can't believe it's right about everything, and the parliament can't believe that the president is overstepping about everything, because the whole point in some ways, part of the purpose of a technocracy is that the executive branch does have a mandate on certain issues and does have to make long-term decisions. You can't half-build a road, for example, and very often in systems like the U.S., Congress votes for municipal bonds for our roads and highways 1 year and repeals it the next year. How does that make any sense, right?
Yes.
So I really do take things issue by issue, and I say, look, you've got to have this conversation about what the right path is, and then it becomes less important whether or not the executive is driving it or whether the parliament is driving it.
Well, what we've had here is a checks and balance system that is being shifted to a parliamentary form of government. Our President Duterte has made it clear he wants to have a parliamentary form of government here. And in many instances, there are strengths of that. From what you know of the Philippines, what type of parliamentary system could work here?
Right. So, the head of state is very strong. There are systems like France. The president is a powerful figure. The prime minister is also the head of government, or rather, the head of the parliament as well. So you can have a stronger balance there, where the executive is strong, but the sort of elected legislature is also very strong. I think that might be an interesting example. You wouldn't want to have a situation where you have long periods of ineffectiveness, like in Italy, where the prime minister is very strong and the president is actually very weak.
Yep.
So there's a case to be made that you may want to look at a French kind of format there, if you will, because obviously there's very strong checks and balances within that system.
Is there an instance in the modern world where a country has shifted from one form of government to another? I guess in this, while we're going through creative destruction of democracies, what do we do in the interim while we're in search of the next iteration?
Well, actually, Maria, you're always in the interim because it's not an all or nothing, off the shelf sort of thing. Countries evolve in different ways. There's nuances, right, to every country. And the further away you get from the colonial era, the more countries that have inherited a British or a French sort of system of government from colonial days, the more they evolve in their own peculiar directions in terms of the power of the courts, the power of the prime minister, the role of the executive. Here in Switzerland, here in Singapore, they're making big moves around restructuring the role of the presidency to make it elected, to give it new powers. So no two countries are the same here. So you're always evolving, and I think this experiment that's that you're undertaking right now around moving towards a parliamentary system, again, it may or may not play out well, because just being one type of system doesn't mean it's necessarily going to work. I mean, we held up the United States as an icon of democracy for a long time, and now we don't. Has the system changed? No. But how it's used and abused has changed.
One of the characteristics that are common in the United States and in the Philippines right now, and many other countries around the world, as more people are empowered, is the amount of collective anger. And that anger is out to destroy, right? And part of the reason you've had the populist leaders elected is precisely because of that anger. How do you handle that anger in the interim as we stumble our way into whatever our next form of government is going to be?
I think that we take this anger and we treat it like it cannot be quelled, as if it's purely emotional, as if it doesn't have some kind of material basis. But it does, in fact, right? If people were educated, if they were in school, if they were employed and at work and in jobs, if they were earning wages that met or exceeded the rate of inflation, right, you would not necessarily have angry people, right? I mean, the Arab Spring was not inevitable if not for the fact that you had high youth unemployment, corrupt government, and so forth. So we have to address these material concerns. I believe emotions are important, but I also believe that they change, right? They are a function of our circumstances. And again, when you have a situation where there's very high inequality, where poverty is not being addressed, where infrastructure is very bad, of course you're going to have anger. But you definitely do not overcome anger by talking about anger, right? You do something about it. And again, as we were talking about earlier, populism isn't bad just because it's populism. There's a reason why people are angry, and I hope that even if Hillary had been elected, she would say, you know what, we've got a lot of angry people out there. Let's do some serious homework as to why, and let's do something about it. For your first and foremost identity is not whether in America you're Democrat or Republican or what party you support in the Philippines or whether you're pro or anti-Duterte, right?
Yeah.
It's you're a citizen of the Philippines. You want to have a decent standard of living and quality of life for everyone.
Yeah.
And in a technocratic system, that's the only thing that counts. What are we doing to maximize the welfare of the citizens?
So, to be devil's advocate though, isn't it just like changing clothes in terms of if there are fundamental issues that haven't been addressed by an existing system, no matter what form of democracy it is, changing to, say, a parliamentary form or another communism, isn't that just changing clothes if the body inside if that core problem isn't addressed? The gap between the rich and the poor, for example, corruption. Is the form of government the problem?
There's a lot of countries that are sort of old wine in new bottles, right? And again, I see this a lot across emerging markets. If you take a place like Egypt, they had the Arab Spring, Mubarak was thrown out, and now you have another military strongman, right? But in between you even had the Muslim Brotherhood. You've had multiple changes of the constitution government. Same thing in Iraq and other places. But I don't want us here in East Asia where economies are thriving, where there's young, industrious, and hardworking populations. I don't want us to be looking at the other side of the world there. We actually can move beyond that. And in fact, what we're trying to do and what you're trying to do in your experiments with governments is say, how can we have a system where when we have good ideas, because there are good ideas that you're seeing all around you, that energy in the Philippines, you're establishing special economic zones, you're signing trade agreements, you're getting in a lot of foreign investment, those are good ideas. You just want to change the political system so that it's one where these good ideas can be implemented as quickly as possible. And I think that's what matters. So of course, if some personality, but I have seen countries. I was just in Pakistan, for example. I've seen a country where obviously it's been through dictatorship, it's had coups, but you have some of the old guard who have sort of woken up. They've bootstrapped. They've become more technocratic. They want to get things done. So there are cases of that too. Again, no two countries are the same. But just remember this: ask yourself this as you go through political reforms: is this going to help us do faster and better the things that we absolutely know we need to do?
Interesting. If you want people to take away one key idea from the book, about the future of democracy, what is it that you want them to take away?
This is a book about the future of governance. I want people to not get hung up on whether or not a country is democratic or not democratic, because guess what? That term means less and less. Remember, the more democracies there are in the world, the more diversity and quality or differential degree of quality there's going to be across them, right? There's lots of countries that are democracies that we don't really think are particularly well-governed states. I want political science to be a science again. I want us to focus on the quality of governance, the quality of institutions, and the measurements and the metrics we use to determine whether or not a country is well run or not well run. And it should not actually surprise you that one of them, that it's not the most important thing, whether or how often you have an election. There's plenty of evidence, plenty of research that tells us from the World Bank and academia that says that the rule of law matters more than any other single factor, for example. And the degree of education also matters a lot. Of course, it's great to be a democracy, right? But again, you need a lot more than just being a democracy. So I want us to look at the metrics of governance. That's what I want people to take away. Let's start to measure in a more neutral way, even-handed way, without using this term democracy as if it necessarily means you're superior. I'm a native Indian, right? I mean, I think whether or not you're Indian, you know that the quality of life for the average Chinese person is a lot better than the quality of life for the average Indian person. The fact that India is a democracy, quite frankly, doesn't mean a whole lot. Yes, emotively, again, it does. It's satisfying to be an Indian in democratic India at some level. But the frustrations, to some degree, are also not worth the cost, and that's why the Philippines, that's why India has elected a leader who's very self-consciously a technocrat.
Interesting. So again, I'm going to push you just a little bit on this. Are you saying that it doesn't matter between a democracy and an authoritarian state as long as it delivers the services to the people?
Well, no, I wouldn't take it that far because, again, there's only a few countries, very few, quite frankly, it's considered in the China exception, really, where you look at a country that doesn't have national level democratic institutions. Obviously, they're playing around with it at the very, very local scale, but obviously it's not a democracy, where the delivery of welfare, the gains for the average citizen have been so profound that there is a degree of satisfaction or acceptance and tolerance of the government and very little sense of what the next or more democratic model could look like, even though there are scholars who work on that. And then again, there's obviously an example like Singapore, where you have a system that has been inherited in terms of who the leadership is, but the institutions are formally democratic, but there's a very strong technocratic hand in shaping policy. Again, a very high degree of satisfaction with the government. Very few people here would trade what they have for life in a haphazard, wayward, hapless Western democracy, right? So again, I believe we should be much more nuanced and at the same time much more methodical about this. The word democracy simply doesn't make you better. And I've spent so much of my life across all these different governments that are so-called democracies and so-called non-democracies, and I find that you can't just say, well, I preferred, quote-unquote, life under democracy. That doesn't really tell you anything.
Fantastic. So the phrase direct technocracy, that's the core of the book. Direct technocracy. pick up his book. Parag Khanna just finished writing Technocracy in America, The Rise of the Info State. Direct technocracy is a movement forward in our search for governments that give to the people, correct?
That's right.
Okay, Parag, thank you. Thanks so much for your thoughts. I'm Maria Ressa. You can continue to tweet. Parag is also on Facebook. His Twitter account is @Parag Khanna. I'm Maria Ressa. Thanks for joining us.